Hello, my name is Dr. Fonda Goldman, and I'm a licensed naturopathic physician with a private practice in Stratford, Connecticut. And today I wanted to talk to you about spiritual nutrition, specifically in the context of the Ayurvedic concepts of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So before we get too far along here, just a note of caution. The information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For any symptoms that are severe or worsening, please contact a qualified healthcare professional. As always, the most important thing is to determine the root cause of any disease and to develop a comprehensive treatment plan, of which nutrition can be an important part. So just a little bit of background on Ayurveda, if you haven't heard about it. Another name for Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine. It's a medical system that's over 5,000 years old. And I think one of the unique things about Ayurveda, somewhat like traditional Chinese medicine, is that it's primarily a paradigm of energy. So people, diseases, actions, foods are all made up of energy and kind of are comprised of different energies. And the way that they determined, since we're talking about food and nutrition and the mind today, specifically, is that the way that they determined food's effect on the body and the mind is that they really observed and even meditated on these effects. Okay, so one of the probably most essential topics in Ayurveda is the concept of Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, or wind, fire, and earth. These are essentially three elements of which people can have a constitution type and diseases can be of a certain variety. So just to give some example here, the concept of Vata or wind is that, like the wind, it is an energy that is light, clear, and moving. And so when somebody has a very high Vata mind, on the positive side, they can be very creative because their mind is light and open, and so they can kind of, they get a lot of creative downloads, really. On the perhaps more negative side is that if there's too much wind in the mind, that the mind has a hard time concentrating and focusing, and so it could show up as something similar to ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. For somebody who has a lot of pitta or fire, the nature of pitta or fire is it's hot and spreading and intense. And so on the positive side, if somebody has a very pitta type mind, they tend to be great leaders and teachers, for example, organizers and kind of people who are in charge. On the negative side, though, if somebody has too much of fire in the mind, is that they can become very easily irritated or angered. For people who have more of a kapha type or earthy type of mind, again, the qualities of kapha or earth is that it's heavy and still and cold. And so people who are on the positive side with the kapha element on the mental level is that they're very compassionate and very, they tend to be caretakers. But if there's too much kapha earth in the mind, it can lead to depression. Because again, depression is sort of this heaviness, it's almost like the mind is too heavy and too still and too cold. So this video is actually the third of a series on the mind and nutrition. So if you have an interest in this topic, you might look at my other videos. One is Ayurvedic psychology of Vata, Pitta, Kapha, of which I just give a very brief summary. So if you want to get more into depth with that, you can see that video. And I also have, from more of a Western perspective, have created a video on managing blood sugar, which fluctuations in blood sugar can really severely affect the mind. So you can have a look at those if those are of interest. So beyond the little background in Ayurveda, so within Ayurveda or traditional Indian medicine, there is this concept that not only are there energies of wind, vata, fire, pitta, or earth, kapha, but there are also these more subtle qualities called sattva, rajas, and tamas. And so let's look at each of these and how they manifest in more of an external way. So Sattva, the energy of Sattva is light, clear, and subtle. And so you can imagine that if the mind is light, clear, and subtle, that this might produce more of sort of a spiritual orientation or spiritual quality to the mental processes. And so actions, external actions that might result from this internal sattvic mind is that you might find somebody in a sattvic state who's very interested in praying or yoga, meditation, or reading spiritual books, that sort of thing. Because that's what their mind is sort of, again, if the mind is light and clear and subtle, spirit is light and clear and subtle. And so the mind has to be as a sort of like clarity and stillness to pick up those subtle properties. So on a positive sattvic state of the mind is that somebody, has some, besides stillness and clarity, there's also some sense of austerity. Rather than crowding the life with a bunch of things or crowding the schedule with a bunch of activities, they're really sort of very clear on what's important and letting go of the rest. And then also on the positive side of the sattvic state is that somebody can more easily enter into what's called samadhi or bliss. From the emotional perspective, somebody who's in a sattvic state is more open to love and compassion and forgiveness. So that's sattva, just to give you some sort of like intuitive understanding of what sattva and sattvic energy is. So the next one is rajas. So rajas is different. Rajas, rather than being light, clear, and subtle, rajas is a bit more fiery and intense. And so this tends to lead to a mind that's more goal oriented, and I would even say sort of externally oriented, because most goals are externally oriented. So somebody who is in a very rajasic state of mind will be doing things like setting and striving for material goals. So it could be, buying a house or buying a car or creating a family or winning some competition or getting some accolade or bumping up in their career to get some new title, that sort of thing. And so the rajasic mind, it's the positive side of the rajasic mind is that when somebody has a rajasic mind, they're usually pretty good at concentrating and focusing and organizing and analyzing. It's that sort of quality of the mind. However, if there's too much of a rajasic quality of the mind, what can happen is that somebody can flip into this sort of like fear-based state or become anxious or envious or jealous or become angered or irritated. Because again, it follows with this sort of external goal orientation or material goal orientation. Because if your mind is always sort of thinking about how do I acquire stuff, whatever it is, house, car, money, relationship, sort of thing, then there can be fear and anxiety involved, because it's like, how do you acquire these things? And then once you have them, how do you keep them? Right. And then it can also be the envy and jealousy can exist because you're sort of looking over your shoulder at what other people are doing, almost like people who get kind of sucked in too much to the internet and social media. They start seeing pictures or seeing other people's lives, and they start thinking to themselves, well, how come I don't have that stuff? And so again, it's again a different orientation and energy of the mind. So that's rajas. And the third energy in this sort of triplet here is tamas. So the energy of tamas is dull and heavy and opaque. And because of these qualities, you can almost think of it as a bit of unconsciousness, actually. And so people who have tend to have a tamasic mind may find themselves like binge watching TV or in some sort of addiction, not just like a drug addiction, but it could be too much sugar or too much, again, social media or whatever it is, their particular thing that helps them check out. Tamas, though, is not always, it may seem negative, but it's not always negative, because you actually need tamas to sleep. So just sleeping itself is a tamasic action. So the mental state Again, with too much tamas in the mind, somebody can be very unconscious and really sort of disconnect from their ability to focus and create goals and follow through on things. And they may also disconnect from the more sort of subtle spiritual aspects of their being. They may end up, sleeping too much. They might even be in a coma. From an emotional perspective, people who are in a tamasic mental state, they can develop too much attachment. They can feel very lonely. They might be drowsy. It can also lead to depression and even violence. But again, I mentioned like with sleep, for example, based on the sort of qualities here, it may seem like sattva is the best and tamas is the worst. But again, everybody needs all of these energies, but in balance. Because if you don't have enough tamas energy, you may not be able to sleep, for example. So there you have it. So let's take a look at sattvic foods and what a general list, again, it's not a complete list, but at least it'll give you some ideas of what a sattvic food is. And again, this whole idea of sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic food is sort of an extreme version of, you are what you eat. So sattvic foods, so we go through different food categories here. Fruits, for example, most fruits are sattvic in nature. But specifically mango, pomegranate, coconut, figs, and peaches are very sattvic foods. And then if you look at the vegetable categories, we have sweet potato, lettuce, parsley, sprouts, leafy greens, zucchini, yellow squash, and asparagus. And if we look at grains, we have basmati rice, tapioca, blue corn, which actually yellow corn will be in a different category, quinoa, and barley. So already, before we go through the whole list, you might think of like, what are the general qualities of these foods? So the general qualities of these foods is that they're fresh, light, nutritious, and they're easily digestible. These aren't, foods that are really going to swing your energy up and down, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional. And so the general quality of these foods is that they end up having this more subtle quality. And so they create the subtle quality or spiritual quality in the mind. Okay, so if we continue on with the list here, if you look at beans, for example, red and yellow lentils, kidney, lemon, mung beans all have primarily sattvic energy. Dairy, so fresh and unprocessed dairy products, cow's milk, ghee, soft cheese, homemade yogurt, goat's milk, paneer. Again, you can see that these are like light and fresh and easily digestible foods. In the meat category, there are none. And part of that is meat tends to be heavy in nature, and also it does invoke also this concept of ahimsa or non-harming. So there is some thought that, again, the energy of violence, even when done in the most humane way, that sort of killing of animals, that energy does get incorporated into the food. And so meats are not included on the sattvic list. Not to say that meat can't be important in the diet on the physical level, but again, if we're talking about just strictly from the point of view of sattvic foods and how they affect the mind, meat is not on the sattvic list. So in terms of nuts and seeds, you have almonds, white sesame seeds. Now, again, white sesame seeds. Black sesame seeds will be on a different list. So also you can see just by that, like the blue corn, yellow corn, white sesame seeds, black sesame seeds, even the color of these things is taken into account, and the energy of colors is taken into account. So again, this is a very different system that we're talking about here. And then another nut that's on this list is cashews. In terms of oils and fats, sunflower oil is helpful, or sattvic, as well as ghee. Spices, so saffron, turmeric, cardamom, cilantro, coriander, fennel, and cumin. So you can see there's like flavor here, but not a lot of heat or spice. In terms of sweeteners, there's turbinado, sucanat, jaggery, and raw honey. So again, these are all natural sweeteners. And drinks, herbal teas that are non-caffeinated. So again, you can see the general qualities here. These are going to be, foods that are right from the tree, right from the ground, pretty much unprocessed, so that you also get the vital energy, right? It's like it's as close to getting like sunlight, almost like you're the plant and you're getting the sunlight from the sky and the water from the ground and your feet are in the soil, rather than have this sort of like middle processing. Again, we're lucky to have processed food because a lot of people would go hungry without processed food. But again, if what we're talking about is just the effects on the mind and the subtle effects of food on the mind, um, if you're looking to sort of spiritualize your mind and your life, you might consider eating a diet more in alignment with this sort of list. So if we look at the next category of rajasic food, so again, this is foods that is going to create more of this sort of goal orientation in life, which can be very helpful, especially if you tend to be in more of a tamasic state of mind. Maybe you need a little bit of fire to get you going. So the general quality of rajasic foods is that they're going to be hot, spicy, sour and pungent, salty, fermented, acidic, stimulating, and chemical. So all of these properties basically create more of a fiery type of food. Hot and spicy, obviously, those are pretty fiery in nature. Sour, the sour taste, whenever something is sour in taste, the sour taste is indication that something has acid in it, and acid is corrosive and fiery. Salty foods, so salt is also a corrosive substance. Like if you drive your car around in winter, um, and they put salt on the roads to break up the ice and snow, is that the salt will, over time, corrode the underside of your car. So salt actually has that kind of hot heat to it, actually. Um, and then fermented foods, one of the side reactions of fermenting a food is that there's going to be acid in it. Um, and most chemicals like tend to have sort of a fiery, corrosive nature. So those are the general qualities of foods. And then let's look at the food category. So fruits, for example, oranges, citrus fruits in general, again, they tend to be sour in nature. Banana, guava, tamarind, there's some of them are slightly sour, but they're also heating in nature, so they're a bit fiery. And as with all sour foods, sour fruits tend to be more rajasic than sattvic, for example. Vegetables, you have potato, tomato, pepper, and eggplant. So already those four, those are in the Solanaceae family, and some people find that, for example, when they eat too much of the Solanaceae plants, it can even aggravate their arthritis because there is this sort of fiery quality to these foods. Also, cauliflower, broccoli, spinach. Some of these, like cauliflower and broccoli, they're in the cruciferae family of vegetables, and so there is this, especially when you eat them raw, there is this sort of pungent, like kind of sharpness to them, and that's because there's a bit of heat and fire in them. Spinach is also more of a warm vegetable, energetically, and winter squash as well. And then pickles. So again, we're talking about salty fermented foods. It's going to be more fiery in nature. So not just like the foods, on their own, like when they come from the ground, how are they, but like how do we prepare them? That's important. So grains that are rajasic in nature. So we have millet and yellow corn. So in contrast to blue corn, which is on the sattvic foods list. So yellow, just as a color, is more sort of sunny and fiery in nature, and blue is more of like a calming color. And actually, the blue color is related to the third eye or the sixth chakra. So if you're into yoga, that'll be meaningful to you. And then buckwheat also. Buckwheat is a little bit more of a heating, energetically heating food. So that's more on the Rajasic food list. Beans, tur dal, adzuki beans, and then small amounts of black and pinto beans. These tend to be Rajasic in nature because they tend to be, again, more heating in nature as legumes. Most legumes are actually cooling in nature, so these are a little bit unusual. Dairy, so sour cream, salted or sour butter, cream, and cottage cheese. So why these things? So sour cream, again, the sour taste. That means that there's a little bit of acid in it. Salted or sour butter. So again, salty things tend to be corrosive in nature, a bit more fiery. Cream, because it tends to be processed. And cottage cheese, even though it's fairly fresh cheese, still fermented. It's not going to be as acidic as other things, but it still does have a little bit of acid in it because it's fermented. So meats, fish, shrimp, and chicken, these are going to be more rajasic. Um, Nuts and seeds, most nuts are actually fiery in nature, so they tend to be rajasic. And we see here brown sesame seeds as opposed to white sesame seeds, which we saw on the sattvic list. So again, color comes into play here. The subtleties of color play into these subtle qualities of sattva, rajas, and tamas. So spices, so you can imagine hot, spicy stuff: curry, chili, cayenne, black pepper, paprika. These are all pretty fiery spices. Sweets, so processed and artificial sweeteners. Again, that the more processed something is, usually there's chemicals involved. Artificial, obviously, chemicals are involved. And then cooked honey. Honey, if it's raw, is sattvic in nature, but once you cook it, the properties tend to change. So it's best just to put honey on top of something rather than add it in and really cook it down. And then drinks, so coffee, black tea, and green tea. Why is this? Because they're caffeinated. So again, this comes down to a chemical, and specifically a chemical that tends to push people, right? That's why people need their caffeinated beverage often in the morning. So usually it's coffee or tea, right? To kind of get them, move them out of that tamasic state while they're sleeping, which we'll talk about next, and get them moving and on their way and get them to work and, cooking breakfast and feeding their family and all this sort of thing. So again, the rajasic foods, they have their time and place, and again, in balance with other foods can be helpful, but it's good to know about these foods and know about these subtle properties so that you can consciously choose what sort of foods you eat, how much of them you eat, and even when you eat them or take them in. They can, so that you have more of a smoothness to how your day runs. So this last category here is of tamasic foods. So again, foods that tend to be a bit dulling in nature. So the general qualities of these foods is that they tend to be heavy and dark, processed and difficult to digest. And so because of that, it's going to be dulling in nature. It's kind of like, on a dark, cloudy, rainy day, it's kind of interesting that in dark, cloudy, rainy places, like they tend to be high consumers of caffeinated beverages. So a dark, cloudy, rainy day is going to be very tamasic and kind of not be so energizing for most people. And then the caffeine, the more rajasic drink, will kind of get you moving. So if you live in Seattle or London, for example, caffeinated coffee or tea will help to balance the kind of heavy effects of the weather that's most prevalent there. Processed foods, again, the reason why that's a part of the qualities is that usually the more processed something is, the less nutritious it is, and so it tends to be sort of more empty calories. So there's actually, even if you're sort of crunching on something or it's filling your belly, it's actually not really doing that much for you in terms of building the body and building strong tissues and, energizing the mind. And then foods that are difficult to digest, that's just like sort of an energy drain on the system. Um, and so it's just, it's just your digestion is just churning and churning and, wasting all this energy rather, in your stomach, in your gut, rather than just easily digesting the foods, absorbing them, assimilating them, and then building healthy, happy tissue or a healthy, happy mind. So let's go through the food categories here. Fruits, there are a few. Again, most fruits are sattvic, but avocado is on this list. So it's a pretty heavy fruit. Most people sometimes don't even realize it's a fruit. And right now, avocados are very trendy. So avocado oil and avocado toast, for example. So if you're trying to get moving out of bed, avocado toast may not be the best breakfast, even though there are definitely some healthy properties in avocado. So you might consider that. Watermelon is also on this list, plums and apricots. Vegetables, so mushrooms, garlic, onions, and pumpkin. Sort of an odd pairing or list here, but they are on the list. They tend to be more sort of, again, opaque and dulling, for the system as a whole and the nervous system. So grains, so wheat and brown rice as opposed to white rice. So again, color comes into play here. wheat tends to have, again, wheat is very, actually, because of its general nature, it tends to draw water into the body. And so a lot of people, when they eat wheat, they may not realize it, but they actually, they do get a bit dull in the body. It changes their energy, both physically and mentally. Um, and it can be a bit addictive. There have been some studies shown that wheat can be addictive. And so, it's also interesting that a lot of sweets, involve not just sugar, but wheat, right? So, again, in proper proportion can be part of a healthy diet, but perhaps if there's too much wheat in the diet, you might think about whether that's the best choice for you and what direction you want to take your health. So there are some beans on this list, so urudal and large amounts of black and pinto beans. So again, it's not just sort of this really speaks to not just the type of food, but the sort of amount of food or proportion of food in your complete diet. So dairy, so hard and aged cheese, again, it's been sitting around for a while. It's very fermented and processed milk. So we're talking about non-organic milk. Ideally milk is raw, but that's not feasible for most modern lifestyles. If raw milk is not an option, then grass-fed organic milk, grass-fed cows is sort of second best, and non-homogenized milk. But that's not an option for a lot of people. So it's hard to actually find non-homogenized milk and grass-fed milk for a lot of people, or it's like just too expensive to do all the time. So again, even if you can do organic milk and get some of those chemicals, some of that processing out, it does help. And eggs are also part of this tamasic list. So meat. So again, the really heavy, hard to digest meats like beef and pork and lamb, they're considered tamasic in nature. Nuts and seeds. So peanuts and black sesame seeds. So we saw sesame seeds. White sesame seeds are sattvic. Brown sesame seeds are rajasic, and black sesame seeds are tamasic. So if that doesn't speak to the power of color. Yeah, so there you go. Spices. So we have jalapeno pepper and nutmeg. So you might think jalapeno pepper, that's pretty spicy. Why isn't that on the rajasic list? Well, the thing is, something can be so spicy that it actually just makes your mouth numb, right? So if it makes your mouth numb and it basically makes your mouth unconscious of all that heat, it can have that effect on the entire nervous system. So consider that. Nutmeg, even though it's tasty and a lot of fall and winter treats, nutmeg actually is pretty powerful. Sometimes I give that to people if they're having trouble sleeping. So again, if they don't have enough tamas in their mental state and they need more tamas so they can get to sleep and get rested, sometimes just even a little pinch of nutmeg is helpful for getting somebody into a tamasic state of mind so that they can get sleep. Sweet, so molasses, dark, thick, you can see the general qualities of tamasic foods here. Stevia, it is a natural leaf, but again, just on its own, its natural kind of qualities, and then all the processing that goes into that, it's considered tamasic food. And then anything that's extremely sweet, flooding your body with sugar. What does it do? I mean, a lot of people, if you think about it, like when somebody gets into an emotional eating state, when they're binging on something, the occasional sweet treat, is okay in balance. But, when people are just, again, numbing themselves out with too much sugar, it can become a tamasic thing when you overdo things, right? So there you go. That speaks to not just quality, but quantity. And then drinks that are tamasic, obviously something like alcohol, where again, that's sometimes why people drink, because they're feeling anxious or they're feeling angry or they have some emotions they're having a hard time processing and they just don't want to deal with it and they just want to disconnect from those feelings, then they might have a drink. And so, there it is. You can kind of see how these energies play out. So again, not to judge, but just to understand the subtle qualities of these different foods and how they can affect the mind so that you can make a conscious decision about maybe how much of these things you're eating or how often you're eating these things, or, you know, what kind of goods you're putting in your shopping cart when you go shopping. Um, they can play a part, especially if you're having trouble, you know, in the mental, emotional state. So there you have it. Hopefully today I've introduced you to a different paradigm of not just medicine, but nutrition. Again, this is something that's so different from sort of the Western point of view, and I find it extremely helpful. You know, again, you can see how some of these energies play out because again, in the Western diet, there's so much processed food and so much really overstimulating food, and you can see how most people's lifestyles revolve around sort of the rajasic and tamasic quality of food. Um, and people are struggling, I think, you know, rather than all this sort of modern life and modern technology helping people out and giving them time and space to do things that, you know, are helpful and relaxing. It sort of has speeded people up. So, so again, there's power in food and power in your free choices. And so hopefully this, again, has been helpful in helping you make choices that you find beneficial. So I thank you for your time, and until the next one, take care.